Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our panel on trafficking in the digital age. Get out now if this isn't the one you meant to come to. My name's Jessie Tannenbaum. I'm a legal advisor at ABA ROLI, and I am excited to be moderating this great panel. We'll be discussing the intersections between trafficking on the internet and how it impacts the rule of law, and specifically looking at trafficking in persons, drug trafficking, wildlife trafficking, and maybe weapons trafficking as well. We have three great panelists today. I'm also really excited that I'm the only lawyer, I think, on stage right now. So our panelists come from different professions and really have a diversity of experience and different perspectives on the convergence of digital and underground marketplaces and illicit trafficking. Robert Bernstein is the supervisory special agent in charge of the criminal division at the FBI's Washington field office. He has more than 20 years of experience at the FBI, where he's worked on organized crime, environmental crime, public corruption, and human trafficking in several different field offices. And most recently, he was the field supervisor for the Washington field office's Child Exploitation and Human Trafficking Task Force, which comprises federal, state, and local law enforcement and investigates matters involving child exploitation, juvenile sex trafficking, and adult sex and labor trafficking. Evan Ratliff is an award-winning journalist who you've probably read in The New Yorker or Wired. He is most recently the author of The Mastermind, Drugs, Empire, Murder, Betrayal, which is the story of a decade-long quest to bring down a criminal network led by a recursive programmer turned criminal genius who could only exist in the networked world of the 21st century. No one asked me to say this, but I bought Evan's book, and I'm about a quarter of the way through it, and it's really good. I'm tired because I stayed up late reading it. So you guys should all, after this panel, go out and buy it. And finally, Danielle Kessler is the Senior Outreach and Policy Manager in the U.S. Office of the International Fund for Animal Welfare, where she works with federal agencies, international government organizations, academics, corporations, and other interested parties to advance IFAW's conservation priorities with a particular focus on combating the illegal wildlife trade. She also oversees their US-based engagement with the Coalition to End Wildlife Trafficking Online, which includes 32 online technology companies. Each of our panelists will give a short presentation about the trafficking issues or cases that they've worked on, and we'll follow that with a robust discussion that seeks to draw out the connections between the different forms of trafficking, how they're influenced by the internet, and how technology can be used to combat them. And we'll definitely allow plenty of time for audience engagement as well. So no one wants to hear any more from me, so we'll begin with remarks from Robert Bernstein. And we have the PowerPoint, I think, that needs to be queued up.
Hello, everybody. My name is Robert Bernstein. I'm the Assistant Special Agent in charge of the Washington Field Office's Criminal Division. My focus is the violent crime program, so I oversee our gangs, our organized crime, our violent crime, and our trafficking squads. So the FBI plays a major role in combating both juvenile sex trafficking and adult sex trafficking and labor trafficking. The squad in particular that handles that is CR18. Next slide, please. So who are we? That squad is composed of about 13 FBI agents that covers Northern Virginia and the District of Columbia. However, because of the internet and cyberspace, our reach is well beyond just our geographical boundaries. The violations that we investigate are child pornography, online enticement, sex and labor, and human trafficking. Next slide, please. So here's an example of one of the cases that was recently adjudicated here in the Eastern District of Virginia. This individual, him and an associate, were rappers, and to basically fund their rapping careers, they engaged in recruitment and use of juvenile sex workers. Next slide, please. And you can play the video here.
The news at 11 continues with a story about selling other human beings right in our backyard. 2 local rappers were just found guilty for trafficking underage girls. Now their victims are standing up to share their stories. Here's Stephanie Ramirez.
He even raps about it. That's 28-year-old Ivan Williams, according to the U.S. Attorney's Office, which says Williams and a 26-year-old rapper named Dennis Davis Jr., both from Hyattsville, trafficked 3 underage girls through Atlanta, Georgia, Maryland, Northern Virginia, and D.C. to pay for their music careers.
He wanted to become a rapper.
That's the same thing Elizabeth Kimball says her second pimp did. At first, Kimball thought he was her boyfriend,
Whom I thought I loved.
and now 28-year-old Kimball told prosecutors at the Anacostia Library she was a vulnerable teen. Thursday is Human Trafficking Awareness Day, and it's not just about human sex trafficking.
While I was in 2nd grade, I was kidnapped and I was taken to multiple states around the country and I was forced into labor trafficking.
2 years ago, the State Department called worldwide human trafficking a $150 billion industry. Today, this D.C. prosecutor says numbers are going up.
I would say yes, and I would say that the victims are getting younger. The kids have cell phones earlier, they're more independent.
And she's hearing
DC is a hub because there's a lot of money here.
We need to know the questions to ask. Hey, are these your parents? That's a good question. Because no, they weren't my parents. They weren't even my relatives.
The survivors are talking to us about what we can do to help. The prosecutors inside, they're talking to the victims still out there.
It's not their fault.
in Southeast, Stephanie Ramirez, USA 9.
And so,
Now, Attorney General Jeff Sessions is calling the conviction of those 2 rappers a win in the fight against human trafficking. Both of them face up to life in prison when they are sentenced in April.
next slide, please. So each one of those defendants, the 2 main, what we call pimps, I guess, the organizers of the operation, the 2 rappers, Dennis Davis and Ivan Williams, both were sentenced to 26 years in federal prison. So you can see that the sentencings for juvenile sex trafficking is quite severe. But I think in looking at that news clip, there's several issues that kind of fold into this conference. The use of the cyber networks in the recruitment of individuals into sex trafficking, into child exploitation is great. And as I go through this presentation, you'll see how there's many challenges associated with technology, both on solving crimes and then also on gaining the evidence of crimes. Next slide, please. This is another example, and I'm giving you 3 examples, and I'll keep it moving because I know we have other panels. But the thing about this is we think of sex trafficking, we think internationally of people coming into other countries engaged in the sex trade. We have to start looking at here, too, within our own communities. And this is another perfect example. That one was here in the District of Columbia. As you saw, they trafficked the women here in Maryland, Virginia, and in the South. Here's another example right in our backyards in Woodbridge, Virginia. You can play this video real quick, please.
A sexual predator who refuses to change his ways. That's how prosecutors are describing a man who's now heading to prison for sex trafficking underage girls. Bureau Chief Julie Carey reports from the Northern Virginia neighborhood where he ran his operation.
Michael Gunn already on the sex offender registry when he moved into this Dumfries home and started up a new prostitution ring. His wife and girlfriend part of the scheme as they lured in 2 girls, aged 14 and 16. Neighbors thought the living arrangement among adults was strange, but say they didn't see the teens there.
Obviously, you want to help. You want to help any young child or that it's going through that, but there was no red flags, there was no signs over there.
Those who counsel human trafficking victims say underage girls are increasingly recruited by pimps.
Well, I think they're much easier to control. They don't have their own well-being or identity established, and they're looking for love, and they're looking for popularity, and they're looking for money.
Investigators say along with his partners, Gunn would drive the girls to nearby hotels to meet customers. Court documents reveal Gunn had quotas for the girls. One of them had to earn $1,000 a night, the other $400. Gunn's scheme began to crumble 2 years ago when Prince William County Police caught him with the 14-year-old in this hotel parking lot. Federal authorities later took over the case. Now Gunn is headed to prison for 30 years. His female partner is about 10. And in an unusual ruling, the judge awarded nearly $650,000 in restitution, money that will go to the young victims. those dedicated to combating human trafficking, hoping this kind of case raises awareness.
It's hiding in plain sight is what we typically see.
In Dumfries, Virginia, I'm Julie Carey, News 4.
Next slide, please. So again, he recruited the girls that he was using through social media. A lot of the customers would be communicating through special apps in reserving time for the juveniles. Let's go to this video here, and then I'll wrap up my presentation.
To know that this right here, her family, is real love. We love her to the end.
After 5 terrifying days, a family reunited. A missing teen is back home tonight after reportedly leaving to meet a man from the internet. Ellison Barber looks at what's next.
24 hours ago, the siblings of Kayla Matei showed us her art.
So Kayla drew both of those.
Oh, the things she helped them draw and begged her to come home.
She takes care of us, and I really want her to come home.
Tonight, her family says she's there, safe, and away from a man she reportedly met on the internet. Mehdi Metzla is 21. He is an Estonian national, but not much is known about him beyond that. He's now charged with using a communication device to solicit certain offenses involving children. It's a felony charge. Police found the pair in Harrisonburg, Virginia. They arrested him and took her to the hospital. Matei is diabetic. Police say she is not physically injured. When it comes to Metzla, the Prince William Police Department says they're still investigating to see if they should add more charges.
Remember, the FBI and Virginia State Police joined this search. The FBI is still involved with it. A source with the agency tells me they are trying to see if Metzla should face federal charges, and they say they'll likely figure that out in the next couple of days. Back to you.
So, again, what's happening is, you know, a lot of people might be my age or a little younger, but, you know, back in the day, we had home phones, we had gatekeepers of communications, which typically were the parents at home. If a school kid called after 9 o'clock, mommy or daddy would answer the phone and make that gatekeeping decision to give the phone to the child or not to talk to a friend. Today, those are gone because everyone has smartphones and ways to communicate online. And so it's now the world is at somebody's fingertip. For example, this individual from Estonia, which you know is way over in Europe, met this girl from Prince William County and convinced her to run away with him. He actually flew from Estonia to Newark, New Jersey, took a bus down from Newark to DC, and then took an Uber from Union Station to Prince William County, picked the girl up, and disappeared. Her parents basically reported her missing, had no clue of any of this relationship. And this individual was very smart. He spoofed his IP addresses. When we first got involved, we thought he was in Tampa, Florida, because that's where an IP address was coming out associated with his use of the internet. In fact, we had a TAC team hit an apartment in Tampa, Florida with no success. The only way that we were able to track him basically was working with our Estonia law enforcement partners. We were able to get his bank information. And as I said, he used Uber. So we were able to then see, well, actually that's how we determined he used Uber, and from the banking information. And from that, we were able to talk to the Uber driver who dropped him off in Harrisonburg. And then we just basically used good investigative work to locate which apartment he had out there, because that's where the university is. So we had to track all available rentals, and we finally caught him out there. So again, what technology is doing to us is a lot of our traditional law enforcement ways of solving crime are being hindered. I don't think anyone ever envisioned, you know, highly encrypted applications being used by children or being used by normal adults and not businesses that are now given to just every iPhone out there. The end-to-end decryption is causing major difficulties in law enforcement in penetrating communications used by criminals. But that's where we're at, because we don't have the legislation or the technology tools to penetrate these types of environments. So in wrapping it up, we could see that there's a lot of quandaries between privacy, law enforcement, and the protection of innocent lives. And I'll conclude at this time.
Great. Thanks so much, Robert, for sharing these cases and some of the challenges that law enforcement is facing with new technologies. Next, we're going to hear from Evan Ratliff.
Hi, so I'm a journalist, so I come from a different perspective, and I'm here partly because I spent the better part of 5 years reporting this book called Mastermind. And to give you just a brief overview of the book as it relates to the topics of the conference, it's essentially about a guy named Paul LaRue, and Paul LaRue was, by most measures, I would say, the biggest cyber criminal in history, and by a lot of measures, maybe the most prolific in terms of breadth criminal of all time in terms of his activities. And the reason you may not have heard of Paul LaRue is that he operated in obscurity for many years, and then when he was caught by the DEA in 2012, he was used as an asset to catch other people involved in his organization for many years. So even his identity was kept secret until relatively recently, the last couple of years. And Paul LaRue was a programmer by training. He was born in Zimbabwe. He grew up in South Africa. He was a self-taught programmer as a teenager. You can think of him kind of like Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, or names that you know of people who have built, companies and empires in technology, except he built his entirely on the other side of the law. And he was such a good programmer that he actually wrote a piece of encryption software in the late 90s that became what's called TrueCrypt, which was for a long time one of the most famous pieces of encryption software to encrypt your laptops and disk drives before the likes of Apple and Microsoft started doing it themselves. So he wrote that piece of software, never made any money on it. So then he started an online pharmaceutical business, which he set up out of the Philippines where he was based. And the way the network operated was he created hundreds of websites where any customer inside the United States could log on and fill out a survey with their symptoms and then purchase, using a regular credit card, painkillers. And that survey, that questionnaire, would then be sent to a doctor who had been recruited inside the United States to write prescriptions. And then those prescriptions would go to pharmacies all over the United States, usually small town mom and pop pharmacies that had been recruited into this network, to then distribute the drugs via a FedEx account, which was owned also by Paul LaRue and his organization, which was called RX Limited. So essentially, from the Philippines, he was operating a drug sales and distribution network inside the United States, which eventually was issuing tens of thousands of prescriptions a week. He was making hundreds of millions of dollars. The highest end estimate is that he was making about the same money as Facebook in 2008, so $250 million a year. Nobody really knows how much money he actually made. And with that money, he then decided to go even more illegitimate. So he started getting into arms trafficking, dealing with South American drug dealers, buying tons of methamphetamine out of North Korea and distributing it. He started selling arms to Iran, and he also recruited a network of mercenaries, ex-US military, British military, and South African military, and Israelis, to basically be hit squads to enforce the deals that he was now making around the world. So he did this from 2004 to 2012. The DEA spent 5 years, from 2007 to 2012, trying to catch him. Initially, just 2 investigators out of the Minnesota office of the DEA basically spent all of their time and lives trying to first locate where he was and then catch him. It was very difficult because he had bribed everyone up and down the chain of command in the Philippines, so he had access to intelligence, he had spies inside the US Embassy, and also because of his tech savvy, so he was able to hide himself behind layers of technology, shell companies, all set up over the internet, and he was essentially operating this global criminal cartel from an old beat-up laptop inside of his house in the Philippines. Eventually, they did lure him out. it's a bit of a spoiler for the book, but they lured him out of the Philippines to Brazil. They were able to get some surveillance on him and eventually set up a sting operation in which they caught him in 2012. Once they had him, he cut a deal with the DEA in which he agreed to inform on, in particular, the mercenaries that he had hired, especially the ex-US military mercenaries, which were of particular interest to the DEA. So a number of those were arrested, they were convicted. Some of them were just sentenced to life in prison. 3 of them were just sentenced to life in prison in the last 6 months. And Paul LaRue himself is currently still in custody awaiting his sentencing. So he kind of touches on almost every aspect of online crime in terms of how you can build a network, operate it anonymously, and also avoid law enforcement through all sorts of techniques, even if you're operating entirely out in the open. You could go to his websites, you could buy drugs. It wasn't the dark web, as they call it now. It wasn't a secret place that was difficult to get to. It was actually, you could just go to Google and Google tramadol, which is a painkiller, and you could buy it from a Paul LaRue website. And just to add one funny footnote that just came up this week, and it's not even in the book, is he's now become a kind of popular choice. If you were watching the Bitcoin session last, he's become a sort of newly popular choice as the possible person who invented Bitcoin, which has long been a mystery since it was launched in 2008. I don't actually think he did, but it's just an example of how the influence that he has in terms of cybercrime and sort of hidden worlds on the internet.
Thank you. So there were a couple slides as well. There we go. Okay. Hello, everyone. Again, Danielle Kessler. I'm with the International Fund for Animal Welfare and oversee our wildlife crime work, combating wildlife crime here in the U.S. I was previously with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and sat within the regulatory agencies of the CITES authorities, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, that do the implementation of our wildlife trafficking or anti-wildlife trafficking laws here in the U.S. So, wildlife cybercrime. So when we talk about wildlife trafficking, I first want to clarify exactly what we mean by that term. So we're talking about just the illegal wildlife trade. And so the primary sort of international law that governs international wildlife trade is that CITES convention that I just mentioned, to which 182 countries, as well as the European Union, are a member of. And that treaty lists species within its appendices under various levels of protection. So at the highest level of protection, species listed in Appendix 1, it's essentially in a ban on commercial trade. And so trade in those would be illegal for commercial purposes. Appendix 2, which consists of most species that are listed in CITES, is about 35,000 species. That is regulated trade. So with the proper permitting, with the proper certificates, the proper documentation, trade in those species can happen as long as it's legal and sustainable. So given that there is an enormous gray area to which, particularly when you're looking at, trade in live animals is probably the most straightforward trade, easiest to identify those species. But when you're talking about derivatives of wildlife, so wildlife parts and products, it can be very difficult if you even haven't had the item there in front of you to identify it to a species level. And when it moves online, that identification becomes even more difficult to determine what species it might be and whether it's protected at any level. And so there is a very significant sort of gray area in terms of what might be considered illegal or sort of suspected illegal. And that's complicated by this movement that we see to online platforms. And so we have seen with wildlife trafficking, and we're talking about it's live animals, it's parts and products, and we've seen a movement from physical marketplaces to online platforms for the same reasons that every bit of commerce is moving online. It's 365 days a year, it's open all the time, it increases the global access to lots of different markets. And so similar to what everyone was saying about drug trafficking, this is largely happening on open source platforms because it's such extensive, the trade. It can function on your open source platforms. We're seeing a little bit on the dark net, on the dark web, but it's largely happening out in the open because it is so difficult to regulate. Because in addition to those international laws, there are national laws that come into play. There may be local and state as well. And so it's very difficult to determine what's legal and what's not. Next slide, please. Oh, do I have a clicker here? There we go. So IFAW's role in this, we've been investigating online wildlife trade since about 2004. I actually participated as a researcher in one of the very early reports that they did, and I remember just being appalled by the items that you could find from a simple Google search. Tiger skins, live tiger cubs for sale, footstools made out of elephant feet, or maps made out of elephant ears, lots of ivory at the time, which was regulated, again, complicated regulations on that, today is banned. And so through our various investigations, we found hundreds of thousands of postings of endangered species products. And that's really those Appendix 1 listed species, the species for which trade is banned in those. We have adapted our methodologies over the years. We have to change our methodologies just as the traffickers are changing how they traffic in these products. So, when we first started looking at this, things were more blatant. Something might be advertised as elephant ivory, openly for sale, no claim of legal documentation. And now, there's more regular use of things like faux ivory when it's not actually faux ivory, terms like bone, and the traffickers are finding a way to still trade in these goods. They're just changing the language with which they're using. So what is the scale of the problem? So again, as I mentioned, we've found hundreds of thousands of postings through our various reports over the years. Our most recent one was Disrupt Wildlife Cybercrime, and we just conducted that in 4 countries, in France, Germany, Russia, and the UK. All of our reports generally go through sort of a 2-phase methodology in which we are looking at a number of platforms. So we're deciding which platforms it is that we're going to examine further, and then we're identifying a list of target species that we might find on those platforms, things that we think are being traded. And then we'll do about a 6-week snapshot in which we will set people out to just do lots of internet searching and using keywords and documenting the findings that they have on those. So for this most recent report that we did, we found more than 12,000 specimens for sale. So that sometimes there's postings that have multiple. You can buy 2 tiger cubs. And so in total, we found close to 12,000, just over 5,000 advertisements. One thing that was interesting of this report was that we saw 80% of the advertisements that we were finding were in live animals. So we're seeing a pretty high uptick in the number of pets and live animals that are being traded online. So that's sort of the big level scale of it. It's significant. It is very hard to, those are numbers that don't have a lot of comparison, right? So again, these are advertisements. It's hard to necessarily drill down and figure out exactly which of those are illegal, which one are scam. We take a very conservative approach when we do our reporting, and we sort of give the benefit of the doubt. So those numbers are conservative, and if something sort of mentions that it has proper documentation, then we're going to go, okay, yeah, it's probably, it might not be illegal. But we do pass along to law enforcement agencies. We have like great relationships with law enforcement agencies, and so when we find these postings, we do pass it along to them, particularly if we think there's illegal activity, so that they can look into it further. So again, this is a global problem. So we have brought some assistance on, some researchers this summer to take a look at, again, we're not in law enforcement, so we can't dive into, sealed closed cases, but we're taking a look at open source databases and websites to see what we can find in terms of wildlife trafficking cases that are being reported in the media and have a nexus to online, so that we can really start documenting what's happening online versus what's happening in physical marketplaces. And so there's one we have in Indonesia, August 2017. This was somebody that was selling orangutans, 2 young orangutans for pets on Instagram. As they looked into that a little bit further, if you're trading in orangutans, you're probably trading in other species and items as well. And so they found gibbons and several other species in that person's possession. And then they also, as they started to delve deeper, are finding possible links to organized crime. So again, as with the drug trafficking, you start going into other illegitimate businesses. We see certainly the same thing with wildlife trafficking, and the same folks are dealing in arms and in drugs trafficking. But it also happens much closer to home as well. So there was a recent case, just March of this year, 4 men in South Carolina were sentenced for being part of a major international turtle trafficking ring. Activity was between January and June of 2016, sorry, not 2019 there. And all of this turtle trafficking was set up using Facebook messaging. And so this was a significant hub between the US and sending turtles, our native turtles that they were collecting to Asia and then receiving them back. So it was a significant trafficking ring there. So the U.S. really has a role in this trade. We are not just a consumer country, but we're also a transit country. Things are passing through our borders en route to other places. And also our native species, as this turtle study shows, our native species are at risk too for this trade. So how do we stop it? So of course, strong political will, strong policies in place at the international, national, local levels. But we also, with the wildlife trafficking, have a huge opportunity here to partner with some of the major tech companies. So IFA, along with World Wildlife Fund and Traffic, have started the Coalition to End Wildlife Trafficking Online. We celebrated our 1-year anniversary in March of this year, and we have a total of 32 companies that are on board now, including some of the biggest names. I'm sure you can recognize many of the logos up there, Facebook and Instagram and Google. And all of these companies have come together to really examine what might be happening on their platforms and work with us to find ways to make sure that the internet is a no-go zone for wildlife traffickers. And so we're working with them to implement strong company policies, to flag posts, to make sure that they can be removing things from their sites that violate their own company policies. So lots of great work going on there, and I'll be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A.
Great, thanks so much, Danielle, and thank you to all of our panelists. I think it's really fascinating. I mean, trafficking, kind of by definition, or almost by definition, is almost always an international crime. But the use of the internet for trafficking has really kind of brought new elements and new challenges to law enforcement. Working with trafficking. Although it also struck me, I think. Robert, when you said that you caught this guy because he used Uber, and if he just gotten a taxi at Union Station, and paid cash, would you have found that girl? I mean, it's creating challenges, but also maybe creating tools that law enforcement and others like NGOs can use when they're looking to combat and investigate trafficking. And so, Robert, I thought I'd start with the first question. If you could maybe comment on some of the challenges, but also opportunities that are presented to law enforcement with new technologies.
Well, I'll give you more of the negatives than the positives, because as you know, government works a little slower than the private industry. So, the problems that we're facing is a lot of times we track people through technology, but as technology advances, some of those tracking techniques need to be updated and expanded. And, we see this in our daily lives. We saw San Bernardino, in which, the government had a challenge in unlocking an iPhone. We have a challenge in intercepting very strong encryptions that, might be useful for government communications or top secret business informations. But as I said, some of these very strong encryption applications are being utilized in day-to-day applications. And so that is giving a very challenge to law enforcement. And I do believe that in time, there's going to have to be some type of legislative fixes in order for law enforcement to continue to do what it does in saving lives, finding missing children, and solving crime.
And kind of, along the same lines, Danielle, I wonder if you could also talk a bit from the civil society perspective. I was really struck that you said people are trafficking on Instagram and on Facebook, and I was for work in New York last week and met with attorneys from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn who had prosecuted a case where they were trafficking in dinosaur fossils on eBay, and even falsifying records, trying to show that they were legitimate when they were really trafficked. And so I wondered from the NGO or civil society perspective, If you could also talk about, how the new technologies that are available help you or present challenges for you in carrying out your investigations. I know NGOs don't have maybe the same legal restrictions that law enforcement have in terms of, having to follow certain procedures or regulations, but also you don't have the access that law enforcement has. So from your perspective, how are new technologies affecting your investigations?
Sure. So it is challenging, particularly you mentioned Instagram and Facebook, to look at those social media platforms, because many of the places where this activity is happening is probably on closed groups or in those Facebook messaging apps. And again, we as an NGO only have access to the open source side of things. And so that's why, we really have taken this collaborative approach with the companies, and they have been very receptive to that in trying to work with them to prevent these things from happening on their platforms and to put these strong policies in place. Because from us just taking, peering in, we can't get into probably a lot of the closed groups where this might be happening. We did look for the first time, our recent Disrupt report did look at some social media platforms. We had not done so before that just because of the challenges. It's frankly a lot easier to look at eBay and search their site for what might be available for sale than it is to figure that out on the social media platforms. But we did, for the first time, do that, and we did find some activity on there. The majority was still in online marketplaces, but we certainly, what we were able to find was also happening on social media. So it's a challenge, and it's one that we think, by really engaging with the private sector in this, what we're trying to approach from an industry-wide approach. So that's why we have such a broad coalition, and we're not just working one-on-one, because we really want this to be adopted as an industry practice and an industry standard.
And following up on that, what are the motivations of the companies that you work with to kind of get involved in the coalition to end wildlife trafficking, and how do you work with them?
Sure. So I can't speak for the companies necessarily, but what I can say is that in working with these companies, they really have a commitment to doing what is right to combat this on their platforms, right? And so they don't want to be facilitating this trade. They want to be proactive about getting it off of their platforms. That's a much better way to approach this, right? To be proactive about it than wait for something to come down and be implicated in one of these cases. And so we also are helping them. Their capacities are limited as well, and we recognize that. They have major things like human trafficking and drug trafficking happening on other platforms too, and so we recognize that wildlife trafficking has a lot of competing resources for it, and so we can offer to them this monitoring on their websites. And so we actually have a whole program of cyber spotters where we train folks up to be really well versed in identifying these products and flagging them for the companies. So eBay implemented an ivory ban about 10 years ago. They just celebrated the anniversary of that, and in the 2 years prior to that anniversary, they removed 100,000 posts that had been flagged for them of products. And so they really are able to use this to proactively get things off of their platforms and to tap into the NGOs, frankly, and civil society as sort of an extra resource and free labor for them.
Thanks. And then Evan, I have questions for you too. I wondered if you could talk, and maybe Robert also, you might have opinions on this, but it's really striking to me that Paul LaRue was able to kind of build this massive criminal empire and keep it running for more than a decade and really evade authorities. I don't even know if he was trying to evade authorities or if authorities just weren't quite able to get to him. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about the jurisdictional issues that are around kind of this type of organized crime that involves, trafficking among different countries and the internet. And also maybe, how, I don't want you to give away the plot of your book, but, he ended up in the U.S. And what does that tell us that, a lot of these cases are ending up in the U.S. courts? What does that tell us about these types of investigations?
Well, I think the answers to those two questions are definitely related in that, the reason that someone like Paul LaRue was able to operate for so long was in part because it's inherently international. He's operating from outside the United States, even though he's selling drugs inside the United States. And the challenges involved in investigating that, particularly for a couple of diversion investigators in Minneapolis who have, their old desktop computers, and they're sort of up against someone who has absolutely unlimited resources, literally hundreds of millions of dollars at his disposal, and the ability to sort of bend technology to hide his location. So for example, if you have a criminal network that's operating and they're using email and you figure out a Gmail address, which they did in this case, you go to Google, you get a search warrant, you go to Google, you can get information. Paul LaRue created his own encrypted email server. So you could get a search warrant, but where would you even go? You'd have to go to him in the Philippines to ask him if he would let you in. So they ran up against all these challenges. And again, if anyone saw the last session, they talked a little bit about MLATs, mutual legal assistance treaties, and the speed with which Paul LaRue was operating in terms of technology was so out of whack with how quickly the authorities could get any information from Hong Kong, where he was laundering money, or from the Philippines, where they might send a request, and that request might go directly to him because he's paid someone off in the office to get that request. So the challenges were immense operating overseas, and I think that's the reason why ultimately he ended up in the US, is that only the DEA, and actually only after years of kind of ignoring Paul LaRue, eventually he got on the Consolidated Priority Target List, which is the CPOT list. It's like the most wanted list of the DEA. Eventually, they applied more resources to looking for him. A bigger part of the DEA called the 960 Group, a more powerful part of the DEA, started chasing him, and they ended up using really old-fashioned law enforcement techniques. They used an insider inside his organization to lure him somewhere where they could arrest him. So ultimately, there are very, very few countries, really probably only the United States, that can do that with an international criminal of that scope. There's just no one else who can put the resources to capturing someone like that. So I think that's sort of the challenge, and also the question is what's it worth? What's it worth to catch someone like Paul LaRue? How many resources should go into catching a single person who's running their own operation?
That's a great question. And before we open up to the audience, I just kind of wanted to circle back around to Robert with another question. I guess one of the things that arose in the last panel, and now Evan has also mentioned, is how traditional law enforcement techniques are often what's most effective, even in fighting these kind of technology-based crimes. And as many of the people in this room are practitioners who work on training and capacity building for law enforcement and justice sector personnel, I wondered if you agree with that perspective, and if you do, if you could talk a bit about it. Sorry.
Well, again, it goes back to, law enforcement has various tools, and unfortunately, some of the technology tools keep changing, and we refer back to traditional law enforcement tools such as cultivating informants, the human capital way of penetrating these organizations. However, in trying to disrupt and dismantle a criminal enterprise, the best techniques is to intercept their communications. And again, that's where either through technology improvements or through better laws and regulations to open those doors pursuant to legal process, governments need that ability, or we're not going to be able to disrupt and dismantle criminal organizations. We're going to just rely on trying to capture one or two individuals, because at some point in time, that source is going to be exposed. So I hope that answers that question.
We have about 20 minutes left, so I would now like to open it up for audience questions. Nobody? All right.
I don't mean to embarrass you, but you didn't invite anybody from Polaris to talk, the sex trafficking.
Are you asking about how we selected the panelists for the panel, or why we didn't? I mean, I'm not going to comment on why we didn't, whether or not we did or did not reach out to any particular organization for panelists, but. Yeah.
We work with Polaris. Polaris has a tip line for human trafficking. That tip line feeds into the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Attorney's Office's task forces in combating human trafficking.
I had a question for Danielle. So you mentioned that you have these spotters who are, I think that's what you called them, who are looking at the platforms and trying to identify posts that then they flag for the companies. What's the timeline on something like that? Like when one of those spotters finds something and then flags it for the company, how long would it take them to respond to that and then do something about it? I mean, I know taking down posts can be immediate, but is the whole process longer than that?
Yeah, so frankly, it's going to depend on the company. So the Cyber Spotter program is actually headed up by our partners in this coalition, World Wildlife Fund and Traffic, and they bring folks in, and there's really, by looking at, for example, the price of an ad, by looking at the language that's used in the ad, by looking at the image and whether or not it's a stock photography, there's certain things that we can train folks up on to identify something that is more likely to be illegal. And then, we have points of contact at all of our coalition member companies, and so it's just a matter of, if we have somebody and they're putting together extensive lists, then we may, bundle all of that and send it over if we have somebody doing sort of long-term investigation. But we also do, if any staff in our office, for example, find something, they'll send it over to me and I can pass it along to the company for them to take a look at. And that's the good thing about getting them to institute company policies, because then they can remove those ads based on it violating their company policy. They have to have no more proof that it is an illegal post. It violates their policy for advertisements, and they can pull it down immediately. So it certainly depends on the capacity of each individual company, but that's one of the things that we're looking at through the coalition too, is to get the capacity up to get them down quickly.
I also have a question for Danielle. I wonder if you have any insight as to if there's a certain number of these, like I can understand as a word to use, like who the purchasers are of in the cases that the other two panelists spoke about. But for some of these animals in question, like with the live animals, these are dangerous animals. Do people, the buyers, actually want the animals, or is it basically an excuse to move large sums of money around some of the time? Is that a thing, or am I making that up?
No, it's very interesting. So there's actually not a lot of research. It's one of the things that we're looking at right now is sort of what are the motivators towards purchasing some of these products, or particularly with the live animals, towards purchasing these exotic pets. And I think we're trying to gather that information now, but there's sort of a spectrum. I think certainly you're going to find instances. We actually have one of our campaigns that's somewhat related to big cats in captivity and folks who may be keeping big cats. And so there is certainly, for some of those, it is not just a casual hobby or a personal pet. This is their business, their exhibitors, and so there are a lot of different drivers for that. There's certainly a business aspect to it. And the other end of that spectrum, there's also folks who just want an unusual pet, and so they want a certain turtle, or they want some sort of something that you don't see that's not a dog or a cat. And that's just, whether that be driven by they want something cool to put on their social media, or what that is what we're frankly trying to get at now. But a lot of it is, again, because there is such a large gray area and such a significant legal trade, we do think that a lot of it is just sort of a lack of knowledge and really not meaning to traffic in wildlife, but sort of being accidental, at least on the point of the consumer.
Okay, this is not so much a question, but I thought this would be a good group to tell this story to. My name is Clifford Brown. I'm with ABA ROLI, but I used to be the USAID mission director in West Africa, in Guinea, Sierra Leone. And I apologize to a couple of the ABA people that I've already told this story to, but when I was there, the defense attaché met a couple of women in downtown Conakry who were Thai, and they spoke English, and they told him their story. They were recruited onto a Maersk Line freighter, promised passage to either Europe or the States, and instead they were brought to West Africa and they were turned into sex workers. The sailors now are afraid to go ashore because of HIV/AIDS, and so they take them out to the boats on small pirogues. And the former defense attaché is now a private investigator here in Virginia, And he says that the same phenomenon is going on in many of the ports in West Africa, which is bad enough by itself, but it gets worse. We believe that there is a connection now to organ trafficking back to Asia. That doesn't involve freighters because it wouldn't be fast enough. It involves airline employees. But I was a sailor myself once, and I know how easy it is to smuggle something on a ship. The idea of bringing a human on a boat is not beyond the pale. It can be done. I don't know to what extent this involves recruitment of victims with the internet or not, but I thought this would be a good group just to tell that story to, because it's a real phenomenon. And I could elaborate if somebody wanted more details, but.
Thanks for that. And I know, just based on my own work with ABA ROLI, that organ trafficking is increasingly a priority. And I think what's kind of evolving as a good practice is that these same investigators and prosecutors that investigate cases of human trafficking for sex and labor are also increasingly investigating organ trafficking, and in some cases because it involves live victims who are essentially being trafficked, but also because the kind of networks and the techniques that are used are often the same. So thanks for sharing that comment. There were a couple of questions. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentations. I mean, I just have the question about.
I think the microphone's not on.
Yes. I mean, the challenges that technology, present in terms of being a tool for crime, but also in terms of being a resource, and how much more the balance worked there. As the gentleman was telling the stories, nothing really sort of sadly new for people who work or volunteer on human trafficking awareness and prevention. So they use these platforms. So, I mean, we had recently the situation with the new legislation to be able to stop Backpage and the closing and everything. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that, because it touches into the topic, but also into the technology aspect of that. But then you mentioned that in the case of this international criminal, you had to resort to old-fashioned techniques. So, I mean, how do we work on that? And then the other concern that came in another panel too is how prepared are we to really deal with the challenges of, as you sort of hinted, the criminals, or sometimes even government, led efforts to undermine, U.S. interests, have so many resources in terms of technology and things like that to get away with what they do. So, I mean, how do we work with that, and how prepared are we?
Firstly, on the Backpage issue, Backpage was like a weekly bazaar that would be like notifying tag sales. But in this particular case, it wasn't notifying tag sales; it was notifying prostitution, basically. And so the government took action against Backpage. In some aspect, that was good. In some aspect, it was bad. In the good aspect, at least we knew where individuals were posting, and we could use that resource to track them and rescue them from that, their plight. After Backpage was taken down, it kind of dispersed the distribution. It's not like it shut down prostitution or sex trafficking. So those challenges still exist. And going back to, again, what I think needs to be done is obviously CLIA, which is the law that kind of gives the government the tools or abilities to do lawful interception, hasn't been updated for many, many years. In fact, it goes back to just at the time that the cell phones were becoming popular. And so I don't know, a lot of the applications, a lot of the voice over internet services, they don't fall under CLIA. So these are the challenges. And then, of course, the technology. Business is very concerned about allowing the government the ability to break or decipher some of the encryption. And so there's got to be a trust factor between government and industry.
I wonder if Mr. Bornstein could comment a little more on what the gentleman said about what's being done and maybe what we can do in terms of this organ, the sales of organs. My suspicion is that they may even be taking the organs from these vulnerable world citizens and then shipping them by air or I don't know, by boat, but anyway, by air, and it's, you know, it's just almost for them a no-brainer. And I would be interested in what you could tell us about, from your perspective, what's going on in terms of prevention.
Well, there's only been a handful of cases that I'm aware of within the United States associated with that type of violation. So I'm not in a position to provide any more foresight in how expansive such operations may be.
I think we have time for about 3 more questions, and I see 3 hands, so I think we'll wrap up with those.
Me? So I see the main company up there, like Facebook and Google. I'm wondering if they're lower companies, so for example, Facebook with WhatsApp, Google with YouTube, if they've also joined this coalition. And I'm also wondering why we can't do a coalition like this for sex trafficking as far as dealing with terrorism, because I know the sex industry is what's funding so much of their activity, especially now using WhatsApp, and we've now found that with ISIS, they are recruiting tons of girls to traffic to be able to do their practice.
Yeah, so membership in the coalition sort of varies company to company depending on a bit on their internal structure. So as we know, Instagram falls under Facebook. Instagram is also a member though. And so it just sort of depends on maybe where the responsibilities for monitoring that sit, whether they're in the same function or separate. YouTube, we have worked with YouTube previously. They are not officially a member of the coalition at this time. We are still and are always recruiting for new members. We have sort of a whole process that we run this through in terms of determining if our resources, if we have enough resources to support a company and whether the company has significant buy-in and will internally to make that partnership and bring them into the coalition. So, so it varies. I would say some of the umbrella companies sort of have everybody underneath them. Some of them join individually, but yeah, we're always looking for more. If anyone has connections into the tech sector, we are always looking for more to come on board.
Mr. Bornstein, I had 2 questions for you. I used to work the human trafficking and sex pornography from a legislative perspective, and at the time there were a couple private nonprofits that were really digging into the tech. I think Ashton Kutcher's Thorn program. They were building a lot of data-enabled tools to be able to automate this, prevent people from having to look at these images, that kind of thing, and trying to port them over to law enforcement in order to track them. So that's my first question is, what kind of public-private partnerships are there? And then the second is, somebody brought one of those tools up to an office, popped it open, and you could see just around the Capitol area probably 40 to 50 people with the most grotesque images that they could geolocate. But he said the main limiting factor was the judicial system didn't have the throughput to go prosecute them. They said they could get maybe 1% to 2% of the worst offenders. Could you comment on that?
Well, firstly, I know our task force is very active in both the District of Columbia and the Eastern District of Virginia take a lot of our cases involving the child exploitation, and we have several online undercover operations ongoing at any time. In regards to the private partnership, there is some complexities to that. In fact, we were working with a source that was developing tools to scrub the dark web in some aspect. But there's a lot of legalities associated with that, because once the images get into your cache, it can be considered that possession of child pornography. So in some aspects, it's a very difficult, the Department of Justice takes a very strong stance and deters, to some extent, private individuals researching or going to those sites because they may themselves become subjects of investigations. And there is a strong tendency, that would be someone's defense in a possession or distribution case. So that's one of the reasons why they deter that. At least the CIAS, which is the DOJ entity that oversees these investigations, highly deters private citizens from assisting in outlying or identifying sites on the internet.
I think there was a question in the back row.
Hello, thank you. So I noticed that there are many logos for Chinese companies up there, and I was wondering if you could just speak for a moment about how the Chinese market plays into this, and also how these Chinese companies are cooperating or not cooperating with your efforts. Thank you.
Yeah, so we have 17 countries around the globe, IFA does, and so we've been working mainly focused here in the US, but also in Asia on finding companies that are working on this issue or are willing to. And we've actually found the companies in China to be highly receptive. Alibaba, Tencent have been really proactive, really good about getting strong company policies in place and removing problematic posts from their website. It's very different. We have an office in China that deals directly with those companies and is more aware of what's happening in the social media and the technology companies there. So they are able to be very effective in their liaising with those companies, and we really have seen a lot of receptivity from those companies.
Thank you. I think this has been a really fascinating discussion. I know we've kind of barely skimmed the surface of the connections between different forms of trafficking and the internet and the rule of law, but I think this has been, a really great opportunity for all of us to learn more and to really start thinking critically about the connections between different forms of illicit traffic and how new technologies both enable the trafficking and also empower NGOs and journalists and law enforcement to combat trafficking. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. Thank you, SIP, of course, for hosting, and especially thank my colleagues, Lauren Cook and Samantha Tu, who conceived of and organized this panel. And then will you all please join me in thanking our panelists.